And now, to introduce our featured and special guest, Alan R. Hoffman earned his BA in history from Yale College and his JD from Harvard Law School. He has practiced law in Boston for 40 years and lives in Londonderry, New Hampshire. As an avid reader of early American history, he became interested in Lafayette in 2002, and after teaching himself French, spent 2 years translating Auguste Lavasseur's account of Lafayette's farewell tour of America. This translation was published in 2006, and it's now in its second printing. Alan has lectured widely on Lafayette and the farewell tour, and has a personal goal of speaking in all of the 24 states and the District of Columbia that Lafayette visited. With today's talk, he's able to check off Maryland, and this makes the 19th state plus the city of Washington in which he has presented. So please join me in a warm Lafayette welcome to Alan Hoffman.
General Lafayette, Ms. Michael, ladies and gentlemen, and friends. Michelle, ladies and gentlemen and friends. What a beautiful day and what a wonderful setting this church is to pay tribute again to Lafayette for a very, very good cause, Preservation Maryland. Thank you, T, for that wonderful introduction. And you folks are going to thank her too, because she had the foresight to give me a time limit. When I first started speaking, they didn't do that usually. And on one occasion that comes to mind in 2008, I was speaking to the American Canadian Genealogical Society in Manchester, New Hampshire, and I was the third of 3 speakers in the morning program, and then there was a free period for lunch, so I figured I had plenty of time, and I'm talking and talking. Everyone seemed engaged, except for one gentleman in the first row who seemed to be nodding out. But then I saw my handler, Ms. Pauline Cousson. I saw her go out the back door, and I heard her heels click, click, click down the hall, and she came into the front door to my left, and I tried to ignore her, but pretty soon she became a distraction. So finally, I turned to her, and she was like this. And I said, Pauline, how many minutes do I have left? And she said, -10. Can I have 7 to wrap up? She said, take 3. And I did. I wrapped up in 3. But seriously, it's really a tremendous pleasure to be here today to talk about Lafayette and Frederick. In 1846, Ensigns and Thayer of New York published a colored broadside entitled Pictorial History of the United States. First slide. In addition to depicting the seals of all the states and the territories around the perimeter, it had printed information about the events of the pre-revolutionary period, battles of the Revolution and the War of 1812, and the census from 1790 and 1840. In the middle of this print, next slide please, you see 3 figures. Washington, of course, in the middle, Franklin to his left, and Lafayette on his good right hand. Not Jefferson or Madison or Hamilton or Adams or even Jackson, but a Frenchman, Lafayette, under the title Pictorial History of the United States. Curious, isn't it? Well, I'm here to tell you not so much. It was June 17, 1825, the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill. That day was the day that the American people gathered in Charlestown, Massachusetts, to attend the laying of the cornerstone of the monument and to hear the address by Daniel Webster. The guest of honor on that day was General Lafayette, the nation's guest, as he was called during the farewell tour. It was the 10th month of his tour of America. On that day, Lafayette, a Freemason since 1776, helped to lay the cornerstone with Daniel Webster and the chief architect. The next slide is a 1900 print of that scene, and it looks like Lafayette is supervising as opposed to actually laying the cornerstone. However, there is a museum in Massachusetts, the National Heritage Museum, which holds in its possession the trowel that he used on that occasion. After the laying of the cornerstone, there was a procession to a spot on the side of the hill where a vast amphitheater had been constructed. According to Auguste Levasseur, the author of Lafayette in America in 1824 and 1825, 45,000 people were present. The 15,000 in the amphitheater were arranged as follows. Lafayette was in front, the guest of honor in an armchair. Around him were the remnants of the Battle of Bunker Hill, then other Revolutionary veterans, then 2,000 ladies brilliantly dressed, who seemed to form a guard of honor to these venerable graybeards, as Levasseur wrote. More than 10,000 people were seated behind them on the benches that were placed in a semicircle on the foot of the hill, and another 30,000 were at the top of the hill. After the invocation by Dr. Thaxter, himself a veteran of Bunker Hill, Webster began his speech. In the middle of his speech, which was a panoramic view of American history from the beginning, with special emphasis on the Revolution, of course, and the Battle of Bunker Hill, he turned to the guest of honor and said as follows: "Fortunate, fortunate man, what measures of devotion do you owe to Providence, which has plotted out the circle of your extraordinary life? You belong to both hemispheres, to two generations. Heaven saw fit that the electric spark of liberty should be conducted by you from the new world to the old, and we, whom duty and patriotism have called here, long ago learned from our fathers to cherish your name and your virtues." The next slide is a portrait of Lafayette. It's apocryphal because the monument hadn't been built yet, but it's Lafayette in front of the Bunker Hill Monument by H.C. Pratt. In the 19th century, and indeed up until the 1930s, Lafayette's reputation in America was extraordinary. He was already popular before his arrival in 1825, when he came as the last surviving Major General of the Continental Army. He was popular by virtue of his important role in the Revolution, his subsequent activities on behalf of his adopted land, America, his close friendship with Washington, and his storybook life. However, this trip during which he toured the country, each of its 24 states, and was treated like a conquering hero, reaffirmed his reputation and elevated him into iconic status. Now, the only analogies that I could think of is the exaltation caused among young people by the Beatles in their tour of the 1960s and the visit of John Paul II in 1979. In the 19th century, when state banks in like the 1830s printed legal tender, Lafayette appeared on bills in more states than any other person except George Washington. The next slide are a couple of Lafayette bills. Scores of counties, cities, towns, and townships, 80 of them, were named Lafayette, Fayette, Fayetteville, Lafayetteville, or LaGrange. Now, LaGrange is not obvious, but it's the name of the chateau that he lived in from 1800 to 1834, and we will show you two views, the front scene and the reverse of Chateau LaGrange. There are even one or two LaGrangevilles. There are countless, of course, streets, squares, parks, and schools. There is a Lafayette Street and Lafayette Avenue, for example, in Baltimore, a Lafayette Street in Frederick, and a Lafayette Avenue in Annapolis. Numerous statues and monuments were built in honor of Lafayette, including an equestrian statue in Baltimore in Mount Vernon Square. The next slide is one of my favorites. It's a bas-relief, except the Lafayette is full-bodied. It's at Prospect Park, Brooklyn. It's by Daniel Chester French. Mount Lafayette was named by the good people of Franconia in 1824. Lafayette College took its name in 1826. There was a Lake Lafayette in northern Florida and the Lafayette River in southern Virginia. After France gave America the Statue of Liberty, America reciprocated. An equestrian statue of Lafayette was commissioned, and it was to be made by Paul Wayland Bartlett. It was given to France. It was quite late in 1908. It's called the Children's Statue because the fundraising was done by American school children collecting coins. It stood outside the Louvre until a pyramid was constructed. some say as a future set for the Da Vinci Code, which event caused its removal to a different location in Paris on the right bank of the Seine. It's very hard to find, by the way. The next slide is the children's statue, and we'll show you one more statue by Bartholdi, Washington and Lafayette clasping hands, and that's in Lafayette Square, Manhattan. President Wilson used Lafayette as a symbol of French aid to America in our revolution to drum up support for our entry into the Great War on the side of the Allies. A poem called The Sword of Lafayette appeared, several Lafayette poems, but in this one it begins with some slight exaggeration. It was the time of our despair when lion-hearted Washington, that man of patience and of prayer, looked sadly at each rising sun. In all the freedom-breeding air of hope and rescue there was none, when lo, as down from heaven let, there came the sword of Lafayette. The last line of that poem ends, "Forget us, Lord, if we forget the sacred sword of Lafayette." Upon the arrival of the American Expeditionary Force in Paris in 1917, General Pershing visited Lafayette's tomb at Picpus Cemetery on July 4th, where his aide, Colonel Stanton, said famously, "Lafayette, we are here." The next slide is Pershing at Picpus. There were several songs with a Lafayette theme. One of them, which is the next slide, is called "Lafayette, We Hear You Calling." It was published in 1918. In 1919, President Wilson named the first national park east of the Mississippi Lafayette National Park. The next slide is a brochure from 1923 of the Lafayette National Park. Unfortunately, we lost that one in 1929 when a couple offered to double the land of what is now Acadia National Park if the name were changed. They actually had to do an act of Congress to change the name. The donors were British citizens, that's true, with a long memory. President Franklin Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress on May 20, 1934. There will be a quiz. That's the 100th anniversary of Lafayette's death, May 20, 1934. And the next slide is that joint session. And there were commemorative events throughout the country. There were 3 commemorative stamps honoring Lafayette in the 50s to the 70s, and one of them we will show you, which is the 1957, the 200th anniversary of his birth. In this century, the Senate made Lafayette an honorary citizen in 2002, and the House passed a resolution in 2007 honoring him on his 250th birthday. However, it's not the same today as it was in the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. America, alas, seems to have forgotten Lafayette. And as proof of that, I cite to you an article which appeared in the New York Times on August 31st, 2007. It was an article talking about the impending exhibition of Lafayette and the Farewell Tour that had traveled from Mount Vernon to Lafayette College to the New York Historical Society. The author writes, "The Historical Society dispatched summer interns to different neighborhoods, including 2 of the streets of the city named for Lafayette, one in Manhattan and one in Brooklyn. The interns, history students at UCLA, asked dozens of people what they knew about the old boy. The responses boiled down to, 'Lafayette, we are clueless.' Definitely among the younger generation, not a soul knew who Lafayette was," said Louise Muir, the Historical Society's president. "Even older New Yorkers offered responses like, quote, 'Never heard of him,' or at best, if they were really on the ball, 'Sounds French.'" But one fireman knew quite a lot, Dr. Mira said, and that was reassuring. And if you think about it, it is appropriate that of all those 35 people that they interviewed, a first responder would know about Lafayette, for that's what Lafayette was, a first responder to our cause. So why was Lafayette America's idol in the 19th century and even the early part of the 20th century? The answer is he played a critical role in making our revolution and continued to support American interests throughout his life. He was simply the best friend this country ever had. He also strived to spread the ideas and the ideals of the American Revolution to Europe, and he reaffirmed his close connections to this country during the Farewell Tour. Born in Auvergne, France in 1757, the next slide should be the Chateau Chavignac, where he was born, and having inherited a prestigious title and great wealth Upon the early death of his father in the 7 Years' War, and later his mother and maternal grandfather, Lafayette sailed for America in April of 1777 to join our revolution on a ship which he had purchased and provisioned with his own funds, carrying with him a commission in the Continental Army, making him a major general, the second highest rank in the Army. At the time, he was 19 years old and a captain in the French Army on furlough. Lafayette and the ship, which he had renamed the Victoire, arrived in Georgetown, South Carolina on June 13, 1777. On June 26th, he and the other volunteers commenced the long trek northward. He was introduced to Washington at a tavern in Philadelphia on July 31st, 1777, and invited to join his staff and serve initially as a volunteer without a command. On September 11, 1777, 5 days after his 20th birthday, in the Battle of the Brandywine, part of the British Army's successful campaign to take Philadelphia, our capital, Lafayette dismounted his horse and drew his sword to keep the retreating American soldiers from fleeing, and was wounded in his left leg. By November 77, Washington was so impressed with the young man's courage, prudence in war councils, and character that he petitioned the Continental Congress for a field command. By December, when the Army entered its winter quarters at Valley Forge, Congress had approved, and Washington put Lafayette in charge of a division of 3,000 troops, not an inconsiderable part of the Continental Army. The next slide is Washington and Lafayette at Valley Forge. It's not a photograph, it's a 19th century print. In 1778, Lafayette served in an abortive campaign to invade Canada in the Battle of Barron Hill, Pennsylvania, in the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey, and in the Battle of Rhode Island, where Lafayette played a role as a mediator between the American commander John Sullivan and the Count d'Estaing, who had arrived with a squadron of the French fleet after the Treaty of Friendship with France had been signed in February. Lafayette was awarded a congressional commendation for his role in the Battle of Rhode Island. The next slide is Charles Wilson Peel's Lafayette, painted in 1778. Lafayette returned to France in 1779 and lobbied for more money and material, the return of the French fleet, and French land troops. It is fair to say that he and Franklin were most responsible for the decision made by the French court to provide that aid in 1780. In March of 1780, Lafayette sailed back to America on a new frigate named the Hermione, tell his paternal friend Washington that help was on the way. The Hermione is the ship that the French have rebuilt to the original specifications, and it's making a return engagement to America in 2015, stopping, among other places, Yorktown, Annapolis, Baltimore. Help arrived in July of 1780 when General Rochambeau brought 5,000 troops and a small flotilla to Newport, Rhode Island. Lafayette's major military contribution to the American cause ensued in 1781 when he was sent to Virginia with 1,200 Continentals. On the route to Virginia, he stopped in Baltimore and persuaded the merchants to extend him credit for the purchase of hats, shoes, blankets, overalls, and shirts for his ragtag troops. Of course, the Continental Army and the Congress had no credit, so he bought those on his personal bond. He then induced the ladies of Baltimore to make the shirts. In a campaign of skirmishes and smoke and mirrors, he and his undermanned army managed to entrap Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, where Cornwallis and his 7,000 troops were defeated after the French West Indian fleet came up from the West Indies, and Washington's and Rochambeau's troops arrived to support Lafayette's troops in the siege of Yorktown. The next slide is a 1791 print of Lafayette at Yorktown. Lafayette returned to France a hero at age 24 and was made a Maréchal de Camp in the French army. Now, Lafayette made a return visit to the United States in 1784, which was very little known, but it was like a prequel to the farewell tour of 1824. He was again treated as a hero and feted wherever he went. Two events of note occurred in Maryland. First, he appeared before the state legislature, who, after he had departed, voted him citizenship, and citizenship for all his descendants. So he is a citizen of Maryland. Secondly, George Washington had ridden with him from Mount Vernon to see Lafayette off, and that was the last time these two great friends saw one another. Washington had a premonition that this would be the case. When he returned to Mount Vernon, he wrote this letter to Lafayette. In the moment of our separation, upon the road as I traveled, and every hour since, I have felt all that love, respect, and attachment for you with which the length of years, close connection, and your merits have inspired in me. I often ask myself as our carriages descended whether that was the last sight I should ever have of you. And though I wish to say no, my fears answered yes. I called to mind the days of my youth and found that they had long since fled to return no more, and that I was now descending the hill I had been 52 years climbing, and that though I was blessed with a good constitution, I was of a short-lived family and might soon expect to be entombed in the dreary mansions of my fathers. These things darkened the shades and gave a gloom to the picture, consequently to my prospects of seeing you again. But I will not repine, I have had my day. During the 1780s, Lafayette played a major role in supporting American diplomacy and interests, first with Franklin and then with Jefferson, who was our minister to Paris from 1785 to 1789. When Lafayette visited Monticello in November of 1824, Jefferson took him to the University of Virginia. At a banquet held in the Rotunda in Lafayette's honor, Jefferson had a speech read for him in which he described Lafayette's role on behalf of America when he, Jefferson, was in Paris. With respect to these accomplishments, the accomplishments that American diplomacy won, which included opening up numerous ports to American trade on most favored nation conditions, and also saving the whaling industry in Nantucket by brokering a contract between the Nantucket whalers and the city of Paris to light all the street lamps of Paris with Nantucket whale oil, Jefferson said of Lafayette, "I only held the nail, he drove it." In 1786, the good people of Nantucket expressed their gratitude by dedicating 1 day's milk from every cow in the island to produce a 500-pound cheese, which they sent to Lafayette in France. That's like sending coals to Newcastle, I suppose. But in 1950, a children's book appeared called A Cheese for Lafayette. Later, Lafayette played an important role in the French Revolution. He called for the summoning of a National Assembly in 1787 at the Assembly of Notables, and was a major player from 1789 to 1791, principally in his role as Commandant General of the National Guard of Paris, a citizens' militia that he created immediately after the fall of the Bastille. He was also the principal author of the French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which became the preamble to the 1791 Constitution. However, his efforts to preserve order and mediate between the king and the people ultimately failed, and when the influence of the Jacobins grew, Lafayette went over the border, the northern border of France, to Belgium. Imprisonment in German and Austrian dungeons followed, and then exile in Danish Holstein and Holland, and upon his return to France in late 1799, retirement as a gentleman farmer until 1815 during the 100 days of Napoleon's return, when he briefly served in the Chamber of Deputies, and again from 1818 to 1824 when he served in the Chamber under the Restoration. He was defeated in the election of February of 1824. Propitiously, in March 1824, President Monroe's invitation to visit America arrived, and Lafayette decided to accept it. In July, he departed for America with his son, George Washington Lafayette, with his private secretary, Levasseur, and a valet on the Cadmus, an American merchant ship. This trip, the farewell tour, was a unique event in our history, if not the history of the world. I know that may sound like an exaggeration, but hear me out for a few minutes. Here is this 67-year-old man, tall but somewhat portly, who walks with a limp and a cane and wears a hairpiece, who has wielded no military power or political authority since 1792, and who then held no public position in either his native land or his adoptive land, America, and he is treated like a conquering hero, like a Caesar or an Alexander, for 13 months in every corner of a vast country. There are parades, militia reviews, dinners, banquets, balls, meet and greets with school children and members of various societies. There are dedications of public buildings, a plethora of speeches, and with customary 13 and voluntary toasts. Triumphal arches are created in many cities to welcome him, including here in Frederick. Americans of all races, each gender, and every age wanted to touch this man who had done so much for their country. A whole cottage industry of consumer goods was created around the visit. There are Lafayette prints, fans, buttons, bandanas, medallions, sheet music, bottles, brushes, baby shoes, hats, ribbons. We have a slide of a Lafayette ribbon, welcome Lafayette ribbon from Philadelphia. The Lafayette ribbon is from Boston. It was worn by the school children in Boston. The next slide is a scarf, and that is a Philadelphia scarf, a Welcome Lafayette scarf. There were Welcome Lafayette drums, Staffordshire, and other ceramics, including coffee pots, plates, platters, bowls, cups, pitchers, and jugs, including a set of dishes commemorating Lafayette's arrival at Castle Garden in New York City. And then there were ladies' kid gloves with his face imprinted on it. That's the next slide. Lafayette gloves. Every American painter wanted to, and many did, paint him from life. The two most famous, perhaps, are the Lafayette by Samuel F.B. Morse, who won the commission of the city of New York to paint Lafayette. That hangs in New York City Hall. And the Lafayette by Thomas Sully of Philadelphia, who painted the portrait for Philadelphia. On August 15, 1824, the Cadmus arrived in New York Bay. The next slide is one of the only portraits of the Cadmus. It was painted in 1822 before it became famous. As Levasseur contemplated Staten Island to his left, quote, "The noise of a cannon caught my attention from another side. It was the artillery of Fort Lafayette." What else? Fort Lafayette, which was announcing the arrival of the Cadmus to the city of New York. The next slide is a 19th century painting of Fort Lafayette. It served as a prison during the Civil War. It was destroyed, unfortunately, about a mile from where I grew up when the Verrazano Bridge was built in about 1960 or 1961. On the following day, Lafayette arrived at Castle Garden at the southern tip of Manhattan on the Chancellor Livingston, accompanied by a numerous flotilla of boats and welcomed by all the military and civilian dignitaries of the city in a crowd of 200,000. The next slide is a ceramic, Lafayette's arrival at Castle Garden. Having been feted in New York City and having traveled to various places in Connecticut and Rhode Island, Lafayette left Rhode Island for Boston on the evening of August 23rd. He was received with honors at the Massachusetts State House on August 24th, and after a banquet visited John Hancock's widow that evening, whom he knew from Revolutionary times. This visit is memorialized in a book of fiction, Louisa May Alcott's An Old-Fashioned Girl. How many of you have read that? None. Okay. It was not as popular as Little Women. It came out the year before. While this is a work of fiction, the story has the ring of truth to it, and its veracity is supported by the familial relationship between Louisa May Alcott's mother, who was a May, and Dorothy Quincy Hancock. They were both related to Mayor Josiah Quincy. In any event, in this story, a grandmother is telling her grandchildren and a friend of theirs about Lafayette's arrival in 1824. Well, by and by, the general, escorted by the mayor, that's Mayor Quincy, drove up. "Dear me, I see him now, a little old man in nankeen trousers and vest, a long blue coat and ruffled shirt, leaning on his cane, for he was lame, and smiling and bowing like a true Frenchman." As he approached, the three old ladies rose and curtsied with the utmost dignity. Lafayette bowed first to the governor's picture, then to the governor's widow, and kissed her hand. That was droll, for on the back of her glove was stamped Lafayette's likeness, and the gallant old man kissed his own face. Then some of the young ladies were presented, and as if to escape any further self-salutations, the Marquis kissed the pretty girls on the cheek. "Yes, my dear, here is just the spot where the dear old man saluted me. I'm quite as proud of it now as I was then, for he was a brave, good man and helped us in our trouble." The next slide is a glove that came down in the Quincy family. So if this story has truth to it, that's the type of glove that Madame Hancock would have been wearing. While in Boston, Lafayette visited Harvard College, where Edward Everett addressed him, and went to Bunker Hill. He visited John Adams in Quincy. On August 31st, he headed north, stopping in Lynn, Marblehead, Salem, Beverly, Ipswich, Newburyport, where there were receptions for him all on one day. Citizens of New Hampshire joined the frenzy surrounding Lafayette's visit on September 1, 1824. It happened to be the day of Franklin Pierce's graduation from Bowdoin College in Maine. Franklin had been selected to give an honorary oration in Latin and wrote his father, Benjamin Pierce, hoping he would attend the ceremony. According to Peter Wallner, who wrote a 2-volume biography of Franklin Pierce, New Hampshire's only president, in this he was disappointed, however, as the old general, General Benjamin Pierce, joined other Revolutionary War soldiers at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to honor General Lafayette, who was on his famous tour of America. So he dissed his son's graduation and honorary Latin speech to spend some time with General Lafayette. After leaving Portsmouth and returning to Boston, Lafayette headed west, stopping at Lexington, Concord, and Worcester, and returned to New York City for his second visit there. In Lexington, Mass., he was greeted by a banner hung on an evergreen at the beginning of the Lexington Green. This banner reads, "Welcome, friend of America, to the birthplace of American liberty." It's 39 feet long. You can't tell it by the slide. It's cloth with green paint for the numbers. It's owned by the Lexington Historical Society. Lafayette left New York City in September of 1824 and headed west to Philadelphia and then south. In the early morning of October 7th, Lafayette and his entourage boarded a steamship bound for Baltimore. Levasseur tells the story of the first of Lafayette's 7 visits to Baltimore during the farewell tour. He really liked Baltimore. He spent more days in Baltimore, 19 days during the farewell tour, than any other city except New York City and Washington, actually Washington, D.C. first, and New York City second. Levasseur writes, "The night was advanced when we arrived at Frenchtown, where the steamboat, the United States, charged with conducting us to Baltimore, had already been waiting for a long time. A little before Frenchtown, on the Maryland border, General Lafayette had found a large delegation, and the aides-de-camp of the governor of this state, who announced to him that they were assigned to accompany him to Fort McHenry, where the governor himself had established his headquarters to receive him. At the moment when we would have been embarking, they informed us that Mr. John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State, had arrived in Frenchtown, returning to Washington, and that he had readily accepted the invitation to join in the retinue of General Lafayette, for whom this was an additional pleasure because Mr. Adams was an old and good acquaintance. He was not only an old and good acquaintance, but he was a Lafayette groupie. He had just spent about 10 days with Lafayette following him around in Philadelphia, and now he was back to Washington, but he had this other opportunity. Well, there is this story that only Levasseur tells, although there's some confirmation to it in Adams' diary. So it's time to go to sleep. It's late at night, and George Lafayette and Levasseur are on deck getting some air, and they see that the Secretary of State, Adams, is going to sleep on one of these very uncomfortable cots with everybody else. So George, being very, a very nice young man, says, "I will give you my bunk down below with the general." And Adams says, "Oh, I can't do that. I don't want to separate the father from the son, or the son from the father." So Levasseur says, "Well, I'm not related to him. I'll give you my bunk." And he says, "Oh, I can't do that. The Committee of Arrangements for Baltimore has established where everyone sleeps, and I cannot act without their approval." So the two of them go to the committee, and they basically persuade the committee, and the committee says, "Well, we'll put another bunk in the cabin." So he joins the others in the cabin, and Levasseur writes, "If aristocracy is in American mores, one must admit at least that the high officials of the government enjoy its prerogatives but little." Now, in John Quincy Adams' diary of the day, he writes, "The ladies' cabin was appropriated for the general and his family, and by his invitation, one of the berths in it was occupied by me." So the story has the ring of truth to it. "During the entire night," Levasseur wrote, "we had sailed in frightful weather." It's a good thing he was below. "But in the morning, when we entered the beautiful Patapsco River, on the banks of which arises the wealthy city of Baltimore, the sun dispersed the clouds, and its first rays, gilding gilding the vast horizons that unfolded before us, permitted our eyes to recognize already the steeples of the city, the forest of ship's masts and that habitually filled the port, and the bastions of Fort McHenry that defends the entrance to it. So when they arrived on the principal bastion of the fort, they had hoisted the national flag that flapped there during the last war. This flag, pierced by 1,000 holes, still bears witness to the vain efforts of British artillery. And of course, this flag still exists, and you can see it in Washington, D.C. At the entrance to the fort, General Lafayette was surrounded by a troop of men clad as simple citizens, for the most part disabled. This troop was the remnant of that which in 1814 proved so energetically to the English how much men who fight for liberty, their country, and their family are superior to mercenaries paid by kings to serve their passions. At the moment when General Lafayette entered the fort, the cannon announced him to the citizens of Baltimore, who at this time were leaving in a crowd to come to meet him, and were covering that long peninsula that jutted out from the city to Fort McHenry between two bays that form the Patapsco River. On the raised platform of the port were joined a large number of former Revolutionary officers, magistrates, etc., and a detachment of infantry, which, in opening its ranks, allowed us to see Washington's tent. Washington's tent from the Revolution had been brought by Mr. Custis, Washington's adopted grandson. General Lafayette, after having tried to calm his initial feelings, advanced towards Washington's tent, where he was welcomed by Governor Stevens, who addressed him in this way. General, in welcoming you and congratulating you in the name of the inhabitants of the state of Maryland, I am fulfilling a task very dear to my heart. But I really fear that I will express only feebly the sentiments of the people whom I am proud and happy to represent on this occasion. It was under this tent, the object of our reverence, that you so often clasped the friendly hand of our illustrious Washington. Often it also saw you contribute your advice toward his wise resolves, or to share with him the fatigue and the frugality of the soldier. You are going to enter the city of Baltimore, and you have already known at another time. Its growth and improvements will offer to you the symbol of our national prosperity under popular institutions and a truly representative government. That was a theme that many speakers talked about, and Lafayette did in his replies, about how the current prosperity was a direct result of the institutions that the revolutionary generation. The monuments that adorn this city will bear witness to you of the feelings which animate which animate us here. After greeting his comrades in arms from the Revolution in the tent, they left Fort McHenry, and the procession formed to enter Baltimore. General Lafayette began the trip in a carriage drawn by 4 horses. The vast stretch of terrain that we had to traverse was to our left, filled by a line of militia on foot and on horse, which formed in columns behind us as we passed in front of them. To our right were all the people, having left Baltimore en masse. We arrived thus at the entrance to the city, where a triumphal arch borne on 4 beautiful Ionic columns had been built. Under this arch, 24 girls clad in white, crowned with myrtle and armed with lances, on each of which was written the name of one of the states of the Union, welcomed the nation's guest, placed wreaths around his neck, and crowned him with laurels. At the same time, the sound of cannon mixed with the animated acclamations of the multitude. The procession continued its route, and after having passed under the triumphal arches, while traversing all the streets, stopped in front of City Hall, where in the principal hall the general was addressed by the mayor. And then he made this reply. In his reply, General Lafayette proved that he had not forgotten the zeal of the inhabitants of Baltimore for the cause of liberty. It was under the auspices of the patriotism of the Baltimoreans. It was with the support of the generosity of the merchants and the devotion of the women of this city that at a difficult time, when there wasn't a day to lose, I was able to begin in 1781 that campaign of which the happy issue has thrown so much luster on the services rendered to our cause. Mr. Mayor, today I admire with pleasure your improvements, your prosperity, your National Guard, your monuments, and there remains nothing more for me to desire, since this morning under the tent of our fatherly and venerated chief, I have pressed the hands of some of those brave voluntary dragoons of Baltimore who made the Virginia campaign with me. After this response, and when they had presented to him all the members of the municipal council, we returned to the principal street of Baltimore, at the center of which a platform covered and decorated with luxurious carpets had been built to receive General Lafayette and those who were accompanying him. It was from there we saw file the militias of Maryland, the martial appearance of which revealed the warlike character of the men of this beautiful country. The entire troop marched to the sound of a military band that played the March of Lafayette. That in front of you is a copy, an original copy of the March of Lafayette from Baltimore in 1824. In any event, they loved Lafayette. Levasseur says, each moment of our stay at Baltimore was marked by the most brilliant fetes, the most delicate attentiveness. It is difficult to do justice to the elegance and the refinements of the inhabitants of this city, in which what one finds the agreeable conjunction of American freedom and French grace. So after Baltimore, Lafayette traveled south. He was present in Yorktown for the 43rd anniversary of Cornwallis' surrender on October 19th, Surrender Day. He spent 10 days with Jefferson at Monticello and several with Madison at Montpelier in November. He spent much of the winter of 1824 in Washington City, making a number of side trips to Virginia and Maryland and western Pennsylvania. He visited Frederick, where we stand today, from December 29th to December 31st, 1824. Now, Levasseur has a brief account of the visit, and there are also newspaper accounts which we'll focus on. But Levasseur writes, to return to Washington, we traveled by Frederickstown, where the general was welcomed eagerly by the population and by a large number of his older companions in arms, among which he recognized Colonel McPherson, at whose house we took lodging. At the public banquet that was offered to him by the city, the table was illuminated by a candelabrum holding a large number of candles, whose base was an enormous bomb fragment carried from the siege of Yorktown. Now, the newspaper reports are a bit more detailed. Early on Wednesday morning last, which would be the 29th, Captain McPherson's troop proceeded to the county line about 16 miles from Frederick to await the approach of the illustrious guest of the nation and to escort him to the Monocacy Bridge, 2.5 miles from town, where the committee appointed to receive the general were stationed. At about 3:30, the approach of the general was announced by a discharge of artillery stationed on the eminence on the west side of the bridge, which signal was reiterated from Barracks Hill. The general was met on the middle of the bridge by the deputation, where Judge Shriver addressed him as follows: yielding to none in the attachment, veneration, and affection we entertain for you, we have undertaken with alacrity the duty assigned us, and now assure you on the part of the citizens of Frederick that they are proud to hail you as a fellow citizen, that they are duly sensible of your kindness in visiting their city, thereby affording to all of them an opportunity of beholding in the beloved friend of Washington the benefactor of their country, and that they are thankful for the occasion which will enable them to testify in person to the friendship and gratitude with which every American bosom is penetrated. Benevolent man, consistent Republican, you enjoy a triumph which neither power nor ambition can command. It is the voluntary tribute of gratitude and affection, warm from the heart of 10 million of free men, for a life of generous, disinterested, and enlightened services in the great cause of civil liberty. Lafayette replied, after having been 40 years ago adopted by a peculiar vote of the state of Maryland, I think myself doubly happy, sir, to be most kindly welcomed by the citizens of Frederick County. The flattering and friendly expressions by which you have been pleased to testify their attention to the vicissitudes of my life and their approbation of my conduct call for my affectionate acknowledgments, while I join in your generous hopes that a day will come when all the sons of men will be entitled to pay their grateful vows on the altar of liberty. Sir, I am eager to follow you, and under your auspices to meet the citizens of Frederick, to whom, as well as you gentlemen, I have to offer my cordial and respectful thanks. After these ceremonies, the general was handed into the barouche, and the procession moved towards the town in handsome order, escorted by an elegant regiment of cavalry. The procession moved up Market Street to the Triumphal Arch at the intersection of Patrick Street, where the escort left the general and went up Patrick Street. General Lafayette and suite in two barouches passed under the arch, where he was received with the highest military honors by the artillery, riflemen, and infantrymen, extending to near the arch at 5th Street. Arriving at the second arch, the general was again joined by his escort and various committees who attended him in procession to the west end of Benstown, and from there to the courthouse, where the orator of the day, William Ross, Esquire, addressed the general. In his speech, after pointing out that no battle occurred during the American Revolution in Frederick County, he said, "But we can direct your attention to subjects of contemplation infinitely more gratifying to your generous and patriotic mind. We can display the practical results of these rational and elevated principles of liberty that led you to our shores. We can point to a population of 40,000 spread over this peaceful valley, all who are cultivating their own fields, reaping their own harvest, and in the full enjoyment of all the blessings of that independence which you contributed so gallantly to achieve. Oh, our distinguished adopted citizen of Maryland, we owe you much for much you adventured for us. When you became a volunteer in our cause, you had but little to hope and everything to fear. In the springtime of your life, when everything was gay, you left the fascinations of a splendid court for our western wilds. At home, honor, wealth, dignity were yours by hereditary claim, without the peril of achievement. Yet all these you put to hazard when you drew your sword in our just but doubtful conflict. For if you had fallen in battle and we had been vanquished, the British historian would have recorded your name as a rash military enthusiast in a rebel's cause. But thanks be to heaven, Providence directed it otherwise. We became free and independent and planted a nation's flag in the Western world, and you gained a name in arms and in history which the malignity of foes cannot tarnish, nor the mists of time obscure." General Lafayette replied, "Your kind invitations and my own desire have brought me here as soon as a visit to this interesting city has been in my power. While I mourn with you the loss of my departed revolutionary companions of Frederick County, I am happy to take by the hand the surviving patriots of that time and in the welcome of their sons to recognize the friendship of their parents." Now, after Lafayette's reply came the dinner at Mr. Talbot's hotel. And at the dinner, there were some toasts, always 13 obligatory toasts, one for each original state, and then voluntary toasts. Obligatory toast number 4 was to General Lafayette. "For his aid in our adversity, we are happy to offer the welcome of our prosperity." The general, after having expressed his thanks, gave this toast: "The city and county of Frederick, may their beautiful hills and valleys continue more and more to enjoy the blessings of fertility, industry, republican institutions, and domestic happiness." Judge Shriver, who had given the speech, made a voluntary toast: "The nation's guest, a volunteer in our revolutionary struggle for freedom, and a witness that its fruit, after more than 40 years' experiment, is prosperity, gratitude, and affection." Mr. Ross, who had given a speech, gave this toast: "General Lafayette, he caught a spark from the altar of liberty which the vapors of the dungeon could not extinguish." Then J.L. Potts, Esquire, who was on the committee, gave this toast: "The memory of Colonel William Washington and the health of Sergeant Lawrence Everhart, intimately connected in history." Now, Sergeant Everhart was a hero, a revolutionary hero. He had a long career, which included service at the Battle of Brandywine, where he may have been one of those who helped Lafayette off the field. He then, later on, joined William Washington, Colonel Washington's cavalry, and saw service in a number of battles, including Cowpens, where he was wounded. So it is interesting that they toasted to his health, which shows that he was actually present, I think. I don't see very many toasts to people's health at these various banquets in the city. So he was a very important figure to the county of Frederick. On the 30th, there was a reception in the morning and a militia review in the afternoon in front of, again, Talbot's Hotel, and a ball at the Golden Fleece that night. He departed for Washington City on the 31st, saying farewell to Frederick. While in Washington City that winter, Lafayette became the first foreigner to address a joint session of Congress and was addressed by Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, who called him, quote, the faithful and fearless champion of liberty. Congress voted Lafayette a national reward of $200,000, which was a lot of money at that time, probably about $3.5 million today, and 24,000 acres of land in northern Florida. Although his original intent was to visit the first 13 states, by this time he had received invitations from all the other states. He decided to accept them, so he left Washington on February 23rd, 1825, and headed south through Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. During his visit to South Carolina, Lafayette's party traveled to Columbia, the capital, where an incident occurred that encapsulates this man that made no distinctions of race, color, or creed. In many of the southern states, the local officials, including those of Columbia, had decreed that slaves as well as freedmen should be kept away from the ceremonies honoring Lafayette, even the parades and the militia reviews. This was because of his well-known reputation as an abolitionist. He had been an abolitionist since the 1780s, and it was known by Americans that was his position. Well, after the militia review or parade, there was a private reception in Columbia, and a militiaman, his name was Maurice Moore, later wrote a memoir in which he included an account of what happened at that reception. He writes, 2 sentinels with fixed bayonets on their guns were posted at the door to prevent the entrance of intruders. Here I saw a strange but pleasant incident transpire. An old African, neatly dressed, came to the front door and started in, but the sentinels interposed their bayoneted guns to bar his entrance. The old man contemptuously pushed them aside, saying, Shaw, Shaw, see guns afore you was born, been where they've been shot by soldiers too. And without further opposition from anyone gained his way. He came straight to the room where the distinguished guest was standing among the crowd and said, I come to see General Lafayette. Lafayette turned, looked at him and remarked, an old acquaintance. Don't tell me who it is. The Negro advanced to the Marquis and bowing, held out his hand. An old acquaintance. Don't tell me who it is. The Negro advanced to the Marquis and bowing, held out his hand, said, Howdy, Master Lafayette. How you do, sir? You remember me? Yes, stop. Don't tell me your name. Ah, I have it. Pompey, belonging to Colonel Buchanan, the first servant who waited on me when I came to America. When I landed at Georgetown, I was taken first to the camp of General Buchanan near there, and Pompey waited on me, said he, as he shook warmly the old man's hand. The nobleman called for a glass of champagne with Pompey, which that worthy took with great dignity. Then he put out his hand and said, Goodbye, Master Lafayette, we getting old. We'll never meet again. God bless you. They shook hands again. Pompey went out, mounted his pony, and started for his home near Winnsboro, saying he'd come to see General Lafayette. Now he'd done that, he was going home. Having visited Charleston, South Carolina, Lafayette headed south to Savannah, Georgia, and then west, stopping in places in Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi. Lafayette's steamboat, the Natchez, ascended the Mississippi and arrived in St. Louis on April 29, 1825. After visiting St. Louis, he proceeded to Kaskaskia, Illinois, Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois again before arriving in Cincinnati on May 19th. Having visited Ohio, he headed eastward through western Virginia, Wheeling, and Pennsylvania. He was one of the earliest travelers on the Erie Canal in 1825 as he returned from the west in time to arrive in Boston for the Bunker Hill celebration. Now, in order to complete his goal of visiting all 24 states, which I hope to duplicate, he traveled to New Hampshire again and then headed east east to Maine, went into Maine, came back through New Hampshire, headed west, through Concord, headed west, and on, after stopping briefly in the State House and in several other New Hampshire towns, he arrived in Claremont, which is on the Vermont border. After staying the night there, he left at 9 a.m. in the morning of the 28th of June in a basket wagon, traveling north along the Connecticut River to Cornish, where the carriage crossed the river to Windsor, Vermont, and relinquished its precious cargo to the authorities of Vermont, the 24th state that Lafayette visited. The next slide is the book, New York, called the Long Island Museum of Art, History, and Carriages. Actually, that's the name of the museum. Apparently, they have a wonderful carriage collection. After Vermont, Lafayette traveled to New York City for the final time. Before he left New York on July 14th, a militia unit that had renamed itself National Guard in honor of Lafayette and his service in the Parisian National Guard saw him off. The next slide is a the painting was commissioned by the National Guard in 1989, the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. They have posters of it of various sizes. This is from the poster. And the legend below, which I don't know if it appears in the slide, tells the story of this militia unit and says, by the end of the 19th century, every militia unit in every state had called itself National Guard. So the reason that we call our militias the National Guard today derives directly from Lafayette and his service in the French Revolution. Like Churchill in World War II, Lafayette lived in the White House in August and September of 1825 during the presidency of his friend John Quincy Adams. On September 7, Adams sent him off home aboard a new frigate called the Brandywine in honor of Lafayette. It is probable that Lafayette was greeted by over 3 million people, about 1/4 of the population, during the farewell tour. Lafayette died on May 20, 1834, but you knew that already. But not before he had played a major role in the Revolution of 1830, which overthrew the Bourbon monarchy for the second time and installed Louis Philippe as King of the French. He was buried in Peak Cemetery with soil from Bunker Hill sprinkled over his coffin. President Jackson ordered the same honors be accorded to Lafayette, the same military honors as John Adams had ordered on Washington's death. America mourned. There were eulogies in churches and state legislatures and in private societies. Edward Everett eulogized Lafayette at Faneuil Hall on what would have been his 77th birthday, September 6, 1834. Everett, you may recall, is the same person who gave a 2-hour address at Gettysburg 30 years later, preceding Lincoln's Gettysburg address. His address, I don't know how long it was, probably 2 hours. It's 100 pages long. It's available. It's quite a very good biography of Lafayette. On December 31st, 1834, John Quincy Adams, now a congressman from Massachusetts, gave the official eulogy of the United States. In the course of this 85-page eulogy, and I'm not going to read it all, he spoke these words: "Pronounce him one of the first men of his age, and you have not yet done him justice. Turn back your eyes upon the records of time. Summon from the creation of the world to this day the mighty dead of every age and every clime, and where among the race of merely mortal men shall one be found who, as the benefactor of his kind, shall claim to take precedence over Lafayette?" When he visited the White House and Congress in November of 2007, France's President Sarkozy repeatedly referred to Lafayette's legacy. At the White House, he told the story of the toast at the birthday dinner that President Adams held for Lafayette on September 6, 1825, the day before his departure. Levasseur tells this story as well. Towards the end of the meal, the president, departing from diplomatic customs that prohibited toast at his table, got up and made the following toast: "To February 22 and to September 6, birthdays of Washington and Lafayette." Profoundly moved to see his name thus associated with that of Washington, the general expressed his gratitude to the president and gave this toast to July 4, birthday of liberty in the two hemispheres. When he, Sarkozy, addressed the joint session of Congress following in the footsteps of Lafayette, Sarkozy noted that he was speaking, quote, under the common gaze of Washington and Lafayette. The next slide is the monumental portrait by Ari Scheffer, which was a gift of the artist to Congress in 1825. It's one of two portraits in the House chamber, one of Lafayette, one of Washington. Having met Sarkozy in Washington, Senator John McCain said, and I am not making this up, it's on the Cornell University exhibit on Lafayette, quote, Sarkozy is the first real pro-American Frenchman I've met since Lafayette. You can check it out. I will end this talk, mercifully you say, with an obituary. Not of Lafayette, but of an obscure Philadelphian by the name of David Kramer. David Kramer died during the blizzard of 1888. He didn't die of the blizzard, but he just happened to die during the blizzard. The obituary, the caption of the obituary in all caps reads, "A man who knew Lafayette dead," and then it continues. David Kramer died on Monday evening the 12th after several months' illness of a complication of diseases in the 73rd year of his age. So do the math, 73 years old, 1888. He many years ago resided in Philadelphia, where he was a contractor and erected many fancy dwellings for the leading men of that city. He was a member of the F&AM, the Masons, Carpenters Association, and the IO of OF, Oddfellows, and at one time was an active member of the city council. In his youth, he had here's the punchline. In his youth, he had the pleasure of seeing and conversing with General Lafayette during his last visit to America. Well, if you did the math, you would know that David Kramer, a successful builder and city councilor, was 9 years old when he met General Lafayette along with literally 5,000 other school children outside Independence Hall on October 4, 1824, and that was apparently the most important, or one of the most important events of his life. Now, I wonder how many other young Americans who greeted Lafayette in 1824 and 1825, when America went crazy over Lafayette, told their children or their children's children, like the grandmother in Louisa May Alcott's book about the experience, and how many 19th century obituaries recall meeting, quote, the faithful and fearless champion of liberty, as Henry Clay called him, or as Judge Abraham Shriver intoned on the Monocacy Bridge on December 29, 1824, the beloved friend of Washington and the benefactor of their country, who led a life of generous, disinterested, and enlightened services in the great cause of civil liberty. Thank you. I said I'd try to keep it